It's late, isn't it? The world's gone quiet, but your mind hasn't. You're scrolling, searching, hoping tonight will be different. I see you. You're not alone. Before we begin, do me a favor. Drop your location and what time it is, where you are in the comments. London at 3 a.m. Texas at midnight. Let's see how far we've traveled to be here together tonight. Tonight, I have 12 stories for you. Some solved, some still mysteries. I'll tell them gently. You might drift off halfway through. That's fine. That's why I'm here. And if these stories help you, subscribe. It helps me reach others like you. So close your eyes. Let the rain fade into background. Let's begin. We're starting with hope, with a story about justice that failed, and then, 20 years later, got it right. A girl named Angie, a mother who never stopped fighting, and the truth that refused to stay buried. Idaho Falls, 1996. This is her story. Angie Dodge was 18 years old in the summer of 1996, and if you'd asked anyone who knew her, they'd tell you the same thing: she lit up a room. Not in that cliché way people say about everyone after they're gone, but genuinely, she had this energy, this warmth that made people feel seen. She was living in Idaho Falls, a city that sits along the Snake River in eastern Idaho. It's one of those places where everyone knows everyone, where the mountains rise in the distance and the summers are bright and endless. Angie had grown up there, graduated from Bonneville High School, and like a lot of 18-year-olds, she was figuring out what came next. She worked at a local business, nothing glamorous, just steady work while she sorted out her future. She had friends, she had dreams, she had a mother, Carol, who loved her fiercely, the kind of mother-daughter bond where they could talk about anything, where Angie would call just to say hi, just to hear her mum's voice. Angie had recently gotten her own apartment, a small place, but it was hers. That kind of independence felt like freedom when you're 18. Your own space, your own life beginning to take shape. She didn't know, of course, that she had less than a month left to live. June 1996. The exact date was June 13th, a Thursday night bleeding into early Friday morning. Angie had been out with friends earlier that evening. Nothing unusual. Laughter, conversation. The kind of night you don't think twice about because you assume there will be 1,000 more just like it. She came home to her apartment, locked the door. The last time anyone who loved her spoke to her, she was alive, she was safe, she was just Angie. Sometime in those dark hours before dawn, someone entered her apartment. What happened next was brutal, violent, the kind of thing that shatters the illusion of safety in a place like Idaho Falls. Angie was sexually assaulted. She was murdered. Her life, all that light and warmth and possibility, was extinguished by someone who saw her as nothing more than an object, a target. Her body was discovered the next morning. Carol Dodge got the call no mother should ever receive. Your daughter, come to the hospital, hurry. But it was already too late. The investigation began immediately. Idaho Falls police descended on the apartment. They collected evidence: DNA, fingerprints, anything that might tell them who had done this. The community was horrified, terrified. If this could happen to Angie, it could happen to anyone. People wanted answers. They wanted justice. They wanted someone arrested, tried, punished. And the police wanted to give them that. Enter Christopher Tapp. Chris was 20 years old. He knew some of the same people Angie knew. He'd been in the same circles, the same parties. When police started interviewing people who might have information, his name came up. Not because he was a suspect. Not at first. Just someone who might know something. But somewhere in those interrogations, something went terribly wrong. The details are painful to revisit. Hours and hours of questioning. Detectives who believed they were closing in on the truth. A young man who, whether out of fear or confusion or desperation to make it stop, began to say what they wanted to hear. A confession. except it wasn't true. Christopher Tapp confessed to being involved in Angie Dodge's murder. He implicated himself. He gave details, some that matched the evidence, some that didn't, some that seemed to come from leading questions and crime scene photos he'd been shown. The DNA found at the scene didn't match him. Let me say that again. The DNA didn't match, but investigators believed his confession was credible. They theorized he'd been there with someone else, that the DNA belonged to an accomplice who'd fled. In 1998, Christopher Tapp was convicted of rape and murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. Case closed, the community thought. Justice served. Except it wasn't justice, because Christopher Tapp didn't kill Angie Dodge. Carol Dodge should have been able to grieve, should have been able to find some sliver of peace, knowing her daughter's killer was behind bars. But something didn't sit right. The DNA didn't match. That fact gnawed at her. How could the person convicted of raping and murdering her daughter not be the person whose DNA was left at the scene? She started asking questions, digging, reading case files, talking to experts. And the more she learned, the more convinced she became they had the wrong man. Imagine that. Your daughter is gone, and now you have to fight not just to find her real killer, but to free the person wrongly convicted of killing her. Carol Dodge became an advocate for Christopher Tapp. Yes, you heard that right. The victim's mother fought to free the man convicted of murdering her daughter because she believed in the truth more than she believed in vengeance. Because she wanted real justice, not just the appearance of it. Years passed, a decade, then another. Christopher Tapp sat in prison, maintaining his innocence. Carol kept pushing. Lawyers got involved, advocacy groups, innocence projects. But the wheels of justice turn slowly, if they turn at all. And then science caught up. By 2019, the world of forensic investigation had changed dramatically. Genealogy, DNA databases, where people upload their DNA to trace their ancestry, had become a new tool for law enforcement. You've probably heard of cases like the Golden State Killer, solved decades later because a distant relative uploaded their DNA to a genealogy site. Investigators decided to take another look at Angie Dodge's case. They took the DNA from the crime scene, the DNA that had never matched. Christopher Tapp ran it through genealogy databases, and they got a hit. Not a direct match, but close enough. A family tree started to form, branches extending, names appearing. Someone related to the person whose DNA was at the scene. Detectives followed the genetic trail, narrowed the possibilities, and eventually they arrived at a name. Brian Lee Drips. He lived in Idaho Falls. He had lived there in 1996. He'd lived in the same apartment complex as Angie Dodge. They'd been neighbors. When police confronted him, he confessed. Not under pressure, not after hours of interrogation, just admitted it. Yes, he said. I killed her. He'd seen her, wanted her, forced his way in, did what he did. And then, for 23 years, he lived his life while an innocent man sat in prison and a mother buried her daughter without ever knowing the truth. In 2019, Christopher Tapp was exonerated, freed. The murder charge dropped. After 20 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, he walked out. Brian Drips was arrested, charged. In 2021, he pleaded guilty to rape and murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Finally, the right person was behind bars. Carol Dodge lived to see it. Lived to see her daughter's real killer brought to justice. Lived to see Christopher Tapp freed. She passed away in 2022, just a few years after that long-awaited resolution. But she knew the truth had finally won. Angie's story is a hard one. It's about violence and loss and a system that failed spectacularly. But it's also about a mother's love, about persistence, about the power of science to correct even the most devastating mistakes. It's about the fact that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes, even after 20 years, the truth finds its way into the light. It's a painful truth that the system meant to protect us sometimes fails. Sometimes it takes a mother's relentless love, decades of advocacy, and the evolution of science to set things right. But when it does, when the truth finally emerges, there's something almost sacred in that moment. Our next story carries a similar thread. Another wrongful conviction. Another life, stolen not by violence this time, but by a mistake. A genuine, tragic mistake that cost a man 11 years. And like Angie's story, it ends with DNA, with science, and with something unexpected. Forgiveness. Ronald Cotton was 22 years old in 1984, living in Burlington, North Carolina. If you'd met him then, you'd have seen a young man trying to build a life. He worked at a local restaurant, had a girlfriend, stayed close to his family. He wasn't perfect. He had some minor run-ins with the law as a teenager. The kind of mistakes a lot of young men make and grow out of. But by 22, he was focused, working, staying out of trouble. He had no idea that his entire future was about to be stolen from him, not by something he did, but by something someone remembered incorrectly. July 1984. In the early morning hours, a young woman named Jennifer Thompson was attacked in her apartment in Burlington. A man broke in through her back door. At knife point, he did something only a monster would do. But Jennifer was extraordinary in her response. Even in the midst of that horror, she made a decision. If she survived this, she was going to remember everything about this man. Every detail, his face, his voice, the way he moved. She studied him, committed every feature to memory, determined that he would not get away with what he was doing to her. She survived, and when police asked her to describe her attacker, she gave them details. Height, build, facial features. She was confident, certain. She'd looked at him, really looked at him, so she could identify him later. Police created a composite sketch. Then they put together a photo lineup, 6 photographs of men who fit the general description. Jennifer looked at those photos, and she pointed to Ronald Cotton. "That's him," she said, unsure. Ronald was arrested. He insisted he had nothing to do with it, that he'd been home that night, that they had the wrong person. But Jennifer Thompson was convincing. She was educated, articulate, absolutely certain. She'd studied her attacker's face. She had no doubt, and juries believe confident eyewitnesses. Ronald Cotton's trial began in early 1985. The evidence against him was thin. No physical evidence tied him to the crime, no fingerprints. No DNA testing wasn't widely used yet. The case rested almost entirely on Jennifer's identification. Ronald's defense attorney argued mistaken identity, pointed out the lack of physical evidence. But Jennifer took the stand, looked directly at Ronald, and said with absolute certainty, "That is the man who did monstrous act with me." The jury believed her. Ronald Cotton was convicted, sentenced to life in prison plus 54 years. He was 22 years old. He kept saying he was innocent. His family believed him. His girlfriend believed him. But he was behind bars, and the world moved on without him. Imagine it. You didn't do it. You know you didn't do it. Everyone who loves you knows you didn't do it. But you're in prison anyway. Ronald spent his days in a cell, surrounded by men who'd actually committed the crimes they'd been convicted of. He filed appeals. He wrote letters. He maintained his innocence to anyone who would listen. Years passed. 1, 2, 5, 10. His girlfriend moved on. Life outside kept turning, and Ronald sat in a cell, paying for a crime someone else committed. In prison, he eventually encountered another inmate, a man named Bobby Poole, and Bobby Poole looked a lot like Ronald Cotton. Ronald heard rumors. Other inmates said Bobby had bragged about a rape in Burlington, about getting away with it while someone else took the fall. Ronald tried to tell authorities, tried to get someone to listen. There was even a hearing where Jennifer Thompson was asked to look at both men. Ronald and Bobby Poole and say which one had attacked her. She looked at both of them, and she pointed to Ronald again. "I've never seen that other man before in my life," she said. The appeal was denied. Ronald went back to his cell. 11 years. That's how long he was in prison. By the mid-1990s, DNA testing had evolved. It was becoming a powerful tool in criminal justice, able to definitively disprove guilt. Ronald's lawyers pushed for DNA testing on the evidence from Jennifer's case. After years of resistance, the state finally agreed. The rape kit, the physical evidence collected in 1984, it had been sitting in storage for over a decade. They tested it, and the DNA did not match Ronald Cotton, not even close. They ran it through the database, and it matched someone else. Bobby Poole, the man Ronald had been trying to tell people about for years. The man who looked like him. The man who'd been in that same prison, who'd reportedly bragged about the crime. Bobby Poole had raped Jennifer Thompson. Ronald Cotton had spent 11 years in prison for absolutely nothing. In June 1995, Ronald Cotton walked out of prison a free man. Exonerated, the state apologized. He received a small settlement, $5,000, which seems almost insulting for 11 years of stolen life, but that's what they offered. He could have been angry. He had every right to be consumed by bitterness. But Ronald chose something else. Jennifer Thompson had been living her life for those 11 years, believing justice had been served. She'd moved on, gotten married, built a career. She felt safe knowing her attacker was behind bars. And then she got a call. They'd made a mistake. DNA proved it. The man she'd identified, the man she'd been so certain about, the man she'd looked in the eye and sworn was her rapist, was innocent. She'd sent an innocent man to prison for 11 years. The guilt was crushing. Jennifer fell apart. She'd been so sure. How could she have been so wrong? She wrote Ronald a letter, an apology. She didn't expect him to respond. Didn't expect forgiveness. Just needed him to know how deeply, desperately sorry she was. Ronald wrote back, and eventually they met, face to face. The woman who'd wrongly identified him, the man who'd lost 11 years because of it. And Ronald Cotton told her the truth. "I forgive you." Not because she deserved it, not because those 11 years didn't matter, but because he refused to let bitterness take any more of his life. What happened next is one of the most remarkable redemption stories in criminal justice history. Ronald and Jennifer became friends, real friends. They wrote a book together, picking cotton about the case, about eyewitness misidentification, about forgiveness. They traveled the country speaking to law enforcement, to universities, to advocacy groups. Jennifer talks about how confident she was, how certain, and how completely wrong. She educates people about the fallibility of memory, about how stress affects recall, about how easy it is for a well-meaning witness to make a terrible mistake. Ronald talks about grace, about choosing forgiveness over anger, about rebuilding a life after everything was stolen. Together, they've changed how police conduct lineups. They've influenced policy. They've opened eyes to the flaws in a system that puts too much weight on eyewitness testimony. Bobby Poole died in prison in 2001, serving time for another crime. Ronald Cotton is free. He's married, has a family. He's lived a life that was almost permanently taken from him. And Jennifer Thompson Canino carries the weight of what happened, but she's channeled it into something meaningful, something that might prevent the next Ronald Cotton from losing 11 years. Theirs is a story of two victims. One crime, one man who did nothing wrong but pay the price anyway. One woman who did everything right, fought back, studied her attacker, tried to get justice and still got it wrong. And somehow, impossibly, they found a way forward together. Science gave Ronald his freedom, but grace gave them both peace. Forgiveness is a strange thing, isn't it? We think of it as something we give to people who deserve it. But sometimes, the most powerful forgiveness comes when it's least expected. When someone chooses grace over anger, peace over bitterness, even when they have every right to rage. Ronald Cotton could have spent the rest of his life consumed by what was taken from him. Jennifer Thompson could have been destroyed by the guilt of her mistake. Instead, they chose each other, chose healing. Not every story ends that way. Our next case doesn't have those answers. No resolution, no closure, no moment where everything finally makes sense. Just questions, theories, and a woman who for 7 years reported being stalked, attacked, terrorized, until one day she was found dead in circumstances so strange, so contradictory that decades later, people still argue about what really happened. Was she murdered by the stalker she'd been reporting for years? Or was there never a stalker at all? Let me take you to Vancouver, to a nurse named Cindy, and to a mystery that refuses to be solved. Cindy James was 44 years old in 1989, living in Vancouver, British Columbia. She was a psychiatric nurse, the kind of work that requires patience, compassion, and the ability to stay calm when everything around you is chaos. She was good at her job. Colleagues respected her. Patients trusted her. Her personal life had been more complicated. She'd been married to a psychiatrist named Roy Makepeace. They'd divorced in 1982, and by most accounts, it hadn't been amicable. There was tension, bitterness, the kind of fracture that doesn't heal cleanly. But Cindy was rebuilding. She had her work, she had friends, she had a life that was hers. And then, shortly after the divorce, something started happening. Something that would consume the next 7 years of her life. It began with phone calls, late at night, heavy breathing, a man's voice, sometimes whispering threats, sometimes just there, listening. Cindy would pick up, and the voice would say terrible things, that he was watching her, that he was coming for her. She reported it to police, changed her number, but the calls continued. Then came the break-ins. Cindy would come home to find her house disturbed. Items moved, windows pried open. Once, she found a dead cat on her porch. Another time, threatening notes left inside her home. She installed better locks, an alarm system, security measures. It didn't stop. The incidents escalated. Cindy reported being physically attacked, grabbed from behind, choked, assaulted in her own driveway or near her home. She'd show up at the hospital with injuries, bruises around her neck, marks on her wrists. Over 7 years, Cindy James reported more than 100 incidents to the Vancouver police. 100. And here's where the story gets complicated. Police investigated. They really did. They took her reports seriously at first, set up surveillance, tapped her phone, tried to catch this stalker, but they never found anyone. The calls were traced, but they came from payphones near Cindy's home. Anyone could have made them. The break-ins left no fingerprints, no evidence of forced entry beyond what Cindy reported. The attacks happened when she was alone, with no witnesses. Detectives began to wonder, was someone really terrorizing Cindy James? Or was Cindy doing this to herself? It's an ugly question, a question that sounds like victim blaming. But the evidence or lack of it kept pointing them there. A psychiatrist evaluated her. There were suggestions of psychological distress, possible delusions, maybe even Munchausen syndrome, a condition where someone fabricates illness or trauma for attention. Cindy insisted it was real. She hired a private investigator, Ozzy Caban, to prove it. He believed her. He documented incidents, tried to catch the stalker in the act. But even he couldn't find concrete proof. Cindy's friends were split. Some believed her completely. Why would she do this to herself? Others worried she was unwell, that she needed help of a different kind. And through it all, Cindy kept reporting, kept insisting someone was trying to kill her. May 25th, 1989, Cindy James disappeared. She'd been at work, then left to run errands. Her car was found abandoned in a shopping mall parking lot 2 weeks later. Her belongings were inside. No sign of struggle, no clues. Search parties combed the area. Police issued alerts. Her family and friends feared the worst after 7 years of reported stalking. Had it finally ended the way Cindy always said it would? For 2 weeks, there was nothing. And then, on June 8th, someone found her. An abandoned house in a residential area of Vancouver. Overgrown yard, the kind of place nobody pays attention to. Cindy's body was lying in the yard, partially hidden, but the scene was strange. Her hands were tied behind her back with a black stocking. Another stocking was wrapped around her neck, not tight enough to strangle, but there. She was fully clothed. No obvious signs of sexual assault. No visible wounds. The autopsy revealed she'd died from an overdose of morphine and other drugs. The levels in her system were massive enough to kill her several times over. But here's what didn't make sense. If she overdosed, who tied her hands? If someone murdered her, why use drugs instead of the stocking around her neck? If she was held captive for 2 weeks, why was there no evidence of that, no signs of prolonged restraint, starvation, or exposure? And perhaps most baffling, how did she end up in that yard, positioned that way, with no clear cause of death beyond the drugs in her system? The official ruling was death by undetermined causes. Not murder, not suicide, undetermined. But everyone had a theory. Theory 1, she was murdered by her stalker. Maybe everything she reported was true. Maybe someone really had been terrorizing her for 7 years, and they finally succeeded. The staging, the tied hands, the stocking could have been part of his ritual. He drugged her, bound her, left her there. The police just never found him. Theory 2, it was suicide, staged to look like murder. Maybe Cindy, after 7 years of fear and disbelief, decided to end her life in a way that would finally prove she'd been telling the truth. She tied her own hands, it's possible with certain knots, took the overdose, and positioned herself to make it look like foul play. A final message. See, I told you someone was after me. Theory 3. Mental health crisis. Maybe there never was a stalker. Maybe Cindy was suffering from a psychological condition that caused her to harm herself. To believe she was in danger when she wasn't. The overdose could have been accidental or intentional, but self-inflicted. The bindings could have been part of a delusion or a cry for help that went too far. Theory 4. The ex-husband. Some people pointed to Roy Makepeace, her ex-husband, a psychiatrist who would know how to manipulate, how to gaslight, how to make someone seem unstable. Maybe he orchestrated it, or hired someone, drove her to paranoia, and then, what? Killed her, drove her to suicide. The theory has holes, but it persists. Decades later, no one knows for certain what happened to Cindy James. Was she a victim of a sadistic stalker who evaded every attempt to catch him? Was she a deeply troubled woman who harmed herself, whether consciously or not? Was there some third explanation, something in between, something we can't see from the outside? The truth is, we may never know. What we do know is this: Cindy James suffered. Whether at the hands of another person or within her own mind, she lived in fear for 7 years. And in the end, she died in circumstances that only deepened the mystery. Her case remains open, unsolved. A puzzle with pieces that don't quite fit, no matter how you arrange them. And sometimes, that's all we get. Not answers, just questions. And the uncomfortable truth that some mysteries refuse to be solved. Some mysteries don't give us the satisfaction of answers. They sit there, unresolved, asking us to make peace with not knowing, with contradictions that can't be reconciled, with questions that lead only to more questions. Cindy James's story is one of those, and maybe that's okay. Maybe not every puzzle is meant to be solved from the outside. But our next case, this one has an answer. It took 30 years. 3 decades of a family living with an empty chair at every holiday, every birthday, every ordinary Tuesday. 30 years of wondering, waiting, hoping. And then, in 2018, science caught up. A cold case, frozen in time since 1988, suddenly cracked wide open. Not because of a confession, not because someone finally talked, but because of a family tree, DNA, and a technology that didn't exist when a little girl named April went missing. Let me take you to Indiana, to 1988, and to the moment when genealogy changed everything. April Marie Tinsley was 8 years old in the spring of 1988. She lived in Fort Wayne, Indiana, with her mother and her siblings in a modest neighborhood where kids still played outside until the streetlights came on. April was in 3rd grade. She had blonde hair, bright eyes, and that particular kind of energy 8-year-olds have, curious, talkative, always moving. She loved her family. She loved playing with friends. She had her whole life ahead of her. On April 1st, 1988, Good Friday, she asked her mother if she could walk to a friend's house a few blocks away. It was early evening, still light out. The kind of errand that felt safe in a neighborhood like theirs. Her mother said yes. April walked out the door, heading down the familiar streets she'd walked dozens of times before. She never made it to her friend's house. Somewhere along those few blocks, someone took her. April was reported missing that evening when she didn't come home. The community mobilized immediately, search parties, flyers, police canvassing the area. Everyone hoped she'd wandered off, gotten lost, would be found safe. 3 days later, a jogger found her body in a ditch about 20 miles away, in a rural area outside Fort Wayne. April had been sexually assaulted and murdered. I won't give you the details. They don't matter for understanding what happened next, and they don't honor who she was. What matters is this: a little girl was taken, and someone destroyed her life before it had barely begun. Investigators collected evidence, DNA, fibers, anything that might identify who did this. They had a DNA profile of the killer. But in 1988, DNA databases were virtually non-existent. You couldn't just run a profile and get a match. You needed a suspect first. Then you could test their DNA to see if it matched. Without a suspect, that DNA sat in a file, waiting. The investigation went cold. For years, April's case haunted Fort Wayne. Her family grieved. Her mother never stopped hoping for answers. The community never forgot. And the police never stopped working the case, even as leads dried up and years turned into decades. And then something strange started happening. In 2000, for 16 years after April's murder, someone left a message. A note, written in crude handwriting, left on a bicycle in a Fort Wayne neighborhood. I murdered that girl, April M. Tinsley. I am sorry. It was signed with a disturbing phrase, taunting police. DNA was found on the note. It matched the DNA from April's murder. The killer was still out there, still in Fort Wayne. And for some twisted reason, he wanted people to know. More notes appeared over the years. Left in strange places, tucked in mailboxes, attached to packages left on doorsteps in various neighborhoods. Same handwriting, same taunting tone, same DNA. It was chilling. The person who killed April hadn't just disappeared. He was living among them, walking the same streets, leaving breadcrumbs like it was a game. But even with the notes, even with the DNA, police couldn't identify him. They had his genetic profile, but he wasn't in any database. He'd never been arrested for a serious crime, never had his DNA taken, so the case stayed cold. April's family waited, the community remembered, and the killer remained free. 30 years passed. By 2018, forensic science had evolved in ways no one could have predicted back in 1988. Genealogy DNA databases, websites like GEDmatch, where people upload their DNA to trace ancestry and find relatives, had become massive. Millions of people searching for their family trees, building connections, discovering cousins they never knew existed. And law enforcement realized, we can use this. You've probably heard of the Golden State Killer case, solved in 2018 using this exact method. Investigators took crime scene DNA, uploaded it to genealogy sites, and found distant relatives of the killer. Then they built family trees, narrowed down possibilities, and identified a suspect. April's case was about to become another success story. Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in DNA phenotyping and genetic genealogy, took the killer's DNA profile and uploaded it to GEDmatch. They got hits. Not direct matches, but distant relatives, second cousins, third cousins once removed. People who had no idea they were related to a killer. Genetic genealogists went to work. They built family trees, traced lineages, followed branches, eliminated possibilities, narrowed the pool, and eventually they arrived at a name: John D. Miller. He was 61 years old in 2018. He lived in Fort Wayne. He'd lived there in 1988. He fit the age range, the geographic profile, everything aligned, but they needed to be sure. Investigators began surveilling John Miller, watching, waiting for him to discard something with his DNA on it. On July 2nd, 2018, he threw away a cup and a napkin at a local business. Police collected them, sent them to the lab. The DNA matched perfectly. John Miller was arrested on July 15th, 2018, 30 years, 3 months, and 14 days after April Tinsley was murdered. When confronted with the evidence, he confessed. He admitted he'd been driving around that evening in April 1988, saw a little girl walking alone, and abducted her. He admitted what he did to her, admitted dumping her body in that ditch. And the notes, the taunting messages left years later, he admitted those too. Said he didn't know why he did it. Some sick compulsion, some need to revisit what he'd done, to remind the world and maybe himself of the power he'd once held over a little girl's life. In 2018, John Miller pleaded guilty to murder, child molestation, and criminal confinement. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He'll die behind bars. April's family finally had answers. After 30 years of waiting, wondering, grieving without closure, they knew who knew why, as much as anyone can understand such senselessness, and they knew he'd never hurt another child. At the sentencing, April's mother spoke. She said that for 3 decades, she'd carried the weight of not knowing, of imagining the person who killed her daughter walking free, maybe living a normal life, maybe even happy. Now she knew, and while it didn't bring April back, it brought something close to peace. April Tinsley's case became a landmark in forensic genealogy. It proved that even decades-old cold cases, cases with no suspects and no leads, could be solved if the DNA was preserved. It proved that killers who thought they'd gotten away with it, who taunted police, who lived freely for 30 years, could still be caught. Since 2018, hundreds of cold cases have been solved using genetic genealogy. Families who waited decades for answers are finally getting them. Killers who thought they were safe are being identified, arrested, held accountable, all because of science. Because investigators refuse to give up. Because April's case showed the world what was possible. April Marie Tinsley was 8 years old. She deserved to grow up, to have a life full of birthday cakes and first days of school and awkward middle school dances and graduations and love and all the messy, beautiful, ordinary moments that make up a life. She didn't get that. But 30 years later, the man who took it from her finally faced justice, and in courtrooms and police stations across the country, investigators looking at other cold cases, other families waiting for answers saw April's case and thought, maybe there's still a chance. Sometimes, even after 30 years, the truth finds its way home. That's how long April's family waited. 3 decades of birthdays she never had. Christmases with an empty chair. Ordinary moments shadowed by the question, will we ever know? And then science answered, not with a confession born of guilt, not with a deathbed revelation, but with DNA, with family trees, with the kind of detective work that didn't exist when April was taken. It's a reminder that time doesn't erase truth, it just waits. Our next story also involves waiting, but this time, the wait wasn't in a small American town, it was international. A case that gripped the world, filled newspapers in a dozen languages, and sparked debates that raged for 8 years. A British student, an Italian city, a murder in a shared apartment, and an investigation that went so spectacularly wrong, it became almost as infamous as the crime itself. This is a complicated story. There are twists, trials, reversals, innocent people accused, guilty people walking different paths to justice, and at the center of it all, a young woman whose life was taken on what should have been just another November night abroad. We're going to Perugia, Italy, to 2007, to a case that asks the world a question it still argues about. When does justice become injustice? Let me tell you about Meredith. Meredith Susanna Karakirka was 21 years old in the autumn of 2007, and she was living the kind of adventure most students only dream about. She was from Colston, South London, a quiet suburb where she'd grown up in a close-knit family. 3 siblings, parents who adored her. She was studious, driven, the kind of young woman who worked hard and dreamed big. Meredith was in her 3rd year at the University of Leeds, studying European politics and Italian. And that fall, she'd won a spot in the Erasmus exchange program, chance to spend a semester abroad in Perugia, Italy. Perugia is a medieval hilltop city in the heart of Italy. Cobblestone streets, ancient architecture, the kind of place that feels like you've stepped back in time. It's also a university town full of students from around the world, all there for the same reason Meredith was: to learn, to grow, to experience life somewhere new. She shared a small cottage on Via della Pergola with 3 other young women, 2 Italian students downstairs. And upstairs, Meredith shared the floor with an American student named Amanda Knox. By all accounts, Meredith was thriving. She'd made friends, both British students and locals. She was taking her classes seriously, improving her Italian, soaking in the culture. She worked part-time at a local bar to make extra money. She called home regularly, telling her family how much she loved it there. She had a British boyfriend, another exchange student. She had plans finish the semester, go home for Christmas, graduate, maybe pursue a career in journalism or European politics. The world felt wide open. On the evening of November 1st, 2007, Meredith went to a friend's house for a quiet dinner. She left around 9 p.m, walked the short distance home through Perugia's winding streets, and let herself into the cottage. Her housemates weren't home. The downstairs girls were away for the holiday weekend. Amanda Knox was spending the night at her boyfriend's apartment. Meredith was alone. Sometime that night, someone broke into the cottage. Someone who should never have been there. Someone who saw a young woman alone and chose violence. By morning, Meredith Kirker was dead. November 2nd, 2007, Amanda Knox and her boyfriend, Rafael Solitito, returned to the cottage around midday. Amanda noticed some odd things. The front door was open, which was unusual. There was a small amount of blood in the bathroom. One of the windows had been broken. She called out for Meredith. No answer. Meredith's bedroom door was locked. Amanda called the police, and when officers arrived and forced open Meredith's door, they found her body on the floor, partially covered by a duvet. She'd been sexually assaulted, stabbed. Her throat had been cut. The room showed signs of a struggle, evidence that Meredith had fought for her life. It was brutal, senseless. A young woman with everything ahead of her, murdered in a place she should have been safe. The investigation began immediately, and almost from the start, it went in directions that would later prove catastrophic. Within days, police zeroed in on Amanda Knox. Why? Several reasons, none of them good. Amanda's behavior after the murder struck investigators as odd. She was affectionate with Raphael in public while police processed the crime scene. She did cartwheels at the police station while waiting to be questioned later, explained as nervous energy, a way to cope with stress, but it looked callous to investigators. She was American, which made her an outsider in a small Italian city. She was young, attractive, sexually active in a way that Italian prosecutors found scandalous. The media started calling her Foxy Noxy, a nickname from her childhood soccer days that now took on sinister overtones. And then there was her account of that night, under intense pressure during lengthy interrogations conducted in Italian, a language Amanda wasn't fluent in. Without a lawyer present, her story shifted. First, she said she'd been at Raphael's apartment all night. Then, after hours of questioning, she implicated her boss, Patrick Lumumba, saying she'd been at the cottage and heard Meredith scream. Later, she recanted, said she'd been confused, coerced, that police had pressured her into saying things that weren't true. But the damage was done. On November 6, 2007, just 5 days after Meredith's murder, Amanda Knox and Raphael Solicito were arrested and charged with murder. The theory that Amanda, Raphael, and some unknown third party had engaged in a drug-fueled sex game that went wrong, and Meredith had been killed when she refused to participate. There was no evidence for this theory, none, but it took hold anyway. While Amanda and Raphael sat in jail, investigators found something crucial: bloody fingerprints and a handprint at the crime scene that didn't match Amanda, Raphael, or Meredith. They ran the prints through databases, and they got a match: Rudy Guedi. Rudy was a 20-year-old drifter from the Ivory Coast who'd been raised in Perugia. He had a criminal record breaking and entering, petty theft. He'd been known to climb through windows, to burglarize homes. His DNA was found inside Meredith's body. His bloody fingerprints were on her possessions. His shoe prints, made in her blood, were at the scene. By mid-November, investigators knew Rudy Guedi had killed Meredith Kupka. He'd fled to Germany after the murder, but was extradited back to Italy. In 2008, he was tried separately under a fast-track procedure and convicted of murder and sexual assault. Sentenced initially to 30 years, later reduced to 16 on appeal. Rudy admitted being in the cottage that night. He claimed he'd been in the bathroom when he heard Meredith scream, came out and saw a shadowy figure fleeing, tried to help Meredith but panicked and ran. His story was riddled with lies and contradictions. The evidence was overwhelming. Rudy Guedi murdered Meredith Kupka, so Amanda Knox and Raphael Solicito were released, right? No. Because Italian prosecutors insisted Amanda and Raphael had been there too, that all three had attacked Meredith together. And that's when this case became truly infamous. In 2009, Amanda Knox and Raphael Solicito went on trial for murder. The prosecution's case relied heavily on DNA evidence trace amounts found on a kitchen knife at Raphael's apartment, allegedly the murder weapon, though it didn't match Meredith's wounds, and on a bra clasp from the crime scene. But that DNA evidence was deeply problematic. The bra clasp had been left on the crime scene floor for 46 days before being collected. It had been moved, stepped over, contaminated. The knife had been tested using methods that were unreliable for such tiny DNA samples. International forensic experts called the DNA evidence worthless, contaminated, inconclusive. But in December 2009, an Italian court convicted Amanda Knox and Raphael Solicito of murder. Amanda was sentenced to 26 years, Raphael to 25. The verdict made international headlines. Amanda's family insisted she was innocent, that she'd been railroaded by a prosecution more interested in their lurid theory than the evidence. Supporters pointed to the lack of physical evidence tying her to the crime scene, the contaminated DNA, the coerced confession, but she was in prison, and Meredith's family, desperate for closure, believed justice had been served. In 2011, an appeals court reviewed the case. Independent forensic experts were brought in to examine the DNA evidence. Their conclusion was damning. The samples were too small, too contaminated, and had been handled so poorly that no reliable conclusions could be drawn from them. The knife, not the murder weapon. The DNA on it, inconclusive at best. Likely contamination. The bra clasp, collected improperly, contaminated, unreliable. There was no physical evidence placing Amanda or Raphael at the crime scene during the murder. Their DNA wasn't mixed with Meredith's blood. There were no bloody footprints matching them. Nothing. In October 2011, the appeals court overturned their convictions. Amanda Knox flew back to the United States. Raphael returned to his life in Italy. You'd think that would be the end of it. But in 2013, Italy's highest court, the Court of Cassation, overturned the acquittal and ordered a new trial. So in 2014, another court reconvicted them. Amanda, in absentia, she stayed in the US, refusing to return. Raphael, in Italy, facing arrest again. It was legal chaos. Convict, acquit, convict again. The case had become a circus. On March 27, 2015, Italy's Supreme Court of Cassation issued its final ruling. Amanda Knox and Raphael Solicito were definitively acquitted. Not just not guilty, but fully exonerated. The court stated there was no credible evidence they'd been involved. After 8 years of trials, appeals, convictions, acquittals, international media feeding frenzies, the truth was officially recognized. Rudy Guedi killed Meredith Kercher alone. Amanda Knox and Raphael Solicito had nothing to do with it. Rudy Guedi was released from prison in 2021 after serving 13 years. He's now free, living in Italy. Amanda Knox lives in the United States. She's married, has a family, works as a writer and advocate for the wrongfully accused. But the damage to her reputation, her years in prison, the global scrutiny, those don't just disappear. Raphael Solicito rebuilt his life in Italy, though the case haunts him too. And Meredith Kercher's family. They lost their daughter, their sister, and then they had to watch as the case became less about her and more about legal battles, media spectacle, international drama. Meredith's mother, Arlene, said it best. Meredith has been forgotten in all of this. Meredith went to Italy to study, to learn, to live. She should have come home for Christmas with stories about pasta and Italian verb conjugations and new friends and cobblestone streets. She should have graduated, should have had a career, a family, decades of life. Instead, she became the victim in a case that exposed every flaw in a system that was supposed to deliver justice. A killer who fled to Germany before being caught. 2 innocent people convicted, acquitted, convicted again, acquitted again. Their lives shredded in the process. A media machine that turned tragedy into tabloid entertainment. And at the center of it all, a young woman who just wanted to spend a semester abroad. Meredith Kercher was 21 years old, and she deserved so much better than what happened to her both in life and after. 8 years. That's how long it took for the truth about Meredith's case to be fully recognized. 8 years of trials, appeals, convictions, acquittals. Sometimes justice is messy, complicated, gets tangled in systems that were supposed to protect it. But the truth eventually finds its way through. Our next story is different. Smaller in scope, but no less devastating. No international headlines. No years of legal battles. Just a tight-knit community in Bristol, England. A 16-year-old girl who loved animals and making people smile. And the unthinkable betrayal that came from inside her own home. But this story isn't just about what was taken. It's about what happened after. About 400 strangers who dropped everything to search. About a city that refused to let her be forgotten. About a family that channeled unspeakable grief into something that helps others. Sometimes, in the darkest moments, you see the best of humanity. Let me tell you about Becky. Rebecca Watts, everyone called her Becky, was 16 years old in February 2015, living in the St. George area of Bristol, England. If you'd met her, you'd have noticed the gentleness first. She was quiet, soft-spoken, the kind of teenager who didn't demand attention, but had a way of making people feel comfortable around her. She had this warmth about her. Becky loved animals, absolutely adored them. She'd stopped to pet every dog she passed on the street, spent hours watching nature documentaries, talked about maybe working with animals someday. Her room was filled with stuffed animals, posters of wildlife, little reminders of the creatures she cared so much about. She was close with her father, Darren. They had that easy relationship some daughters have with their dad's inside jokes. Shared TV shows, the kind of bond built on 1,000 small moments. Her stepmother Angie loved her too. They'd blended their families, and while it wasn't always perfect what blended family is, they were making it work. Becky had struggled a bit in her early teens. Anxiety, some social difficulties, the normal turbulence of adolescence amplified by her sensitive nature, but she was finding her way. She had friends. She was doing better in school. She was figuring out who she was. She had no idea that someone in her own extended family saw her as something else entirely, not as a person, as a target. February 19th, 2015. Becky was home alone that afternoon. Her parents were at work. It was an ordinary Thursday, the kind of day that feels unremarkable because you assume there will be 1,000 more just like it. Her stepbrother, Nathan Matthews, came to the house. Nathan was 28, significantly older than Becky. He'd been part of the family structure for years through his mother Angie's relationship with Becky's father. He had a girlfriend, Shauna Hoare. What happened in that house that afternoon was something no family should ever have to imagine. Nathan and Shauna attacked Becky. The details are brutal, and I won't walk you through them. What matters is this. They killed her, deliberately, violently, in the place she should have been safest. And then they dismembered her body, placed her remains in a suitcase, and hid it in a shed behind Nathan's house. When Becky's parents came home and found her missing, they immediately knew something was wrong. Becky didn't just leave without telling anyone. She didn't run away. She was a homebody, anxious about the world, happiest in her room with her stuffed animals and her family nearby. They called the police, and Bristol responded. Within hours, the community mobilized. 400 volunteers, 400 people who didn't know Becky personally, who had their own lives and responsibilities, who dropped everything to search for a missing 16-year-old girl. They combed the neighborhoods, distributed flyers, knocked on doors, checked parks, alleys, anywhere a frightened girl might hide or an unconscious girl might have been left. Becky's face was everywhere, on posters, on social media, on the local news. The whole city seemed to hold its breath, hoping for a miracle, hoping she'd wandered off and gotten lost, hoping she was alive somewhere, scared but safe, waiting to be found. Her father made tearful public appeals. Becky, if you can see this, please come home. We love you. You're not in trouble. Just come home. The search continued for days, and with each passing hour, hope dimmed just a little more, because deep down, everyone knew. When a girl like Becky disappears without a trace, without her phone, without a word, it's rarely a happy ending. On February 27th, days after Becky disappeared, police made a breakthrough. They'd been investigating, following leads, checking CCTV footage, interviewing family members, and something pointed them toward Nathan Matthews. When they searched his home, they found her. In a shed in the garden, in a suitcase. The details of what had been done to her were so horrific that even seasoned investigators were shaken. Nathan Matthews and Shauna Hoare were arrested immediately. The city of Bristol, which had been holding vigil, hoping against hope, now had to face the unthinkable truth. Becky wasn't missing. She hadn't run away. She hadn't gotten lost. She'd been murdered by her own stepbrother, in her own home, while her family was at work, trusting that she was safe. The trial began in the fall of 2015. Nathan Matthews admitted to killing Becky, but claimed it had been a kidnapping plot gone wrong, that he'd planned to abduct her, frighten her, but not kill her. The jury didn't believe him. The evidence showed premeditation, planning, deliberate violence. Shauna Hall claimed she hadn't known what Nathan was planning, that she'd been horrified by what happened, but the evidence showed she'd helped. She'd been there. She'd participated in the cover-up, in the dismemberment, in hiding Becky's body. The details that emerged during the trial were sickening. The purchases they'd made in preparation, the way they'd cleaned up, the fact that they'd returned to normal life afterward, even attending the vigils for Becky, standing among the searchers, pretending to care. In November 2015, Nathan Matthews was convicted of murder, sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 33 years. Shauna Hall was convicted of manslaughter, sentenced to 17 years. Justice, in the legal sense, was served, but for Becky's family, no sentence could ever be enough. Becky's family, her father Darren, her stepmother Angie, her siblings were shattered. They'd lost Becky, and they'd lost her in a way that defied comprehension. Murdered by someone who was supposed to be family, someone who'd sat at their dinner table, someone they'd trusted. But in the midst of that unbearable grief, they made a choice. They established the Becky Watts Foundation. Its mission to support families of missing children, to raise awareness, to provide resources, emotional support, guidance through the nightmare of having a child disappear, to honor Becky's memory by helping others in the darkest moments of their lives. The foundation has helped countless families since 2015. It's partnered with police, with advocacy groups, with media organizations. It's kept Becky's name alive not as a victim, but as a catalyst for good. Becky loved helping people. She loved animals, yes, but she also had this instinct to nurture, to care, to make things better for those around her. She didn't get to live long enough to do that herself, but through her family's strength, through the foundation that bears her name, she's still doing it. The community of Bristol didn't just search for Becky those 8 days in February. They held her in their hearts. They showed up for her family. They proved that even when the worst happens, even when evil hides inside the place you least expected, there's also this overwhelming goodness. 400 strangers searching, thousands more sharing her photo, saying her name, refusing to let her be forgotten. That's what community means. And that's what Becky's family has built in her honor. A community of people who understand loss, who support each other, who make sure no family faces that darkness alone. Becky Watts was 16 years old. She loved animals. She loved her family. She had a gentle soul in a world that wasn't always gentle back. She should have grown up, should have worked with animals, maybe, should have had birthdays and Christmases and all the ordinary, beautiful moments that make up a life. Nathan Matthews took that from her, but he didn't take her legacy. He didn't take the love her family has for her, and he didn't stop the good that's been done in her name. Sometimes, when the worst of humanity shows itself, the best of humanity rises to meet it. 400 people searching. A foundation that helps families years later. Love that refuses to be extinguished by violence. That's what rises from tragedy when people choose to honor a life rather than just mourn a death. If you're still awake, still here with me, thank you. You made it, all the way through. That means something. And if you drifted off somewhere along the way maybe, during Brian's impossible disappearance, maybe while we were in Perugia, maybe during the rain and the quiet, that's okay too. That's exactly why I'm here. You'll wake up tomorrow and wonder where you left off, and maybe you'll come back tomorrow night. Before you go, or before you sleep, do me one last favor. Drop your location and time in the comments. I asked at the beginning, and I'm asking again now. From London at dawn to Los Angeles at midnight, from small towns to big cities, let's see how far we travel together tonight. And if these stories helped you, if they gave your restless mind something to hold on to, if they made the silence a little less heavy, subscribe. It helps me reach others like you. People who can't sleep, people who need stories, people who understand that sometimes the darkness is easier to face when you're not facing it alone. I'll be back tomorrow night, the night after, Whenever sleep won't come and you need a voice in the dark, I'll have more stories, more mysteries, more journeys through the complicated, messy, sometimes beautiful pursuit of truth. Until then, remember Angie's mother, who fought for 20 years. Remember Mary, who waited 28. Remember Sylvia, who turned her daughter's murder into a movement. Remember that persistence matters, that science catches up, that love, sometimes, is stronger than hate. And remember that even in the darkest stories, there are people who refuse to give up, who keep searching, who keep fighting, who keep believing that truth matters. Rest well, or try to, anyway. The rain will keep falling, and I'll be here. Whenever you need me, good night.